Hello, everyone, and thank you for everyone attending our webinar today at South24. Thanks to our guests, Ryan Mauro and Ryan Bohel and Mr. Omar Al-Baid, who is going to join us also soon. Today, we're discussing the latest developments in Yemen and South Yemen. And we all know while the destructive civil war in Yemen enters its 8th year, which caused the world's worst catastrophe according to the UN, there is an urgent need today for, and stronger than ever, to end the war completely and to launch a comprehensive peace process to save this poor country from danger of full collapse and starvation that we hear the international community is talking about every day. The 2-month truce announced by the UN on April 1st, 2022 is approaching its end soon. The Yemeni observers and those who are interested in the Yemeni affair cautiously waiting for the post-truth conditions. Speaking to the press on May 27th, the UN envoy to Yemen, Hans Gordenberg, said the truce is holding in military terms. He clearly indicated that he saw its considerable positive impact and that all fronts across Yemen have witnessed a remarkable calmness. Practically, in the last third of May, Gordenberg resumed its consultations with the Yemeni parties in an attempt to extend the truce on one hand and to launch an inclusive multi-tracks operation on the other hand. This could serve as a platform in which all parties address critical issues to reach more sustainable arrangements and political settlements. Both the Houthis and the Saudi-led coalition have stuck to the truce at the level of external attacks to end from the Yemeni borders. The two parties have not declared any breaches of the truce since it was declared. As we know all today, the truce is extended and all the parties supposedly has agreed to extend this truce. On the other hand, Yemeni parties, including the Houthis, the Yemeni government, and the southern forces, accused each other of committing repeated violations at several fronts, such as Taz, the West Coast, Ad-Dala, Ma'rib, and Hajjah. They announced casualties in the ranks of soldiers and civilians during the truce time. However, South24 Center believes that this is the first truce since the outbreak of the Yemeni war in 2014, which has achieved a remarkable success to some extent. The truce presented drastic political change at the top level of the Yemeni presidency. Former Yemeni president, of course, Abdrabbu Mansour Hadi, and his deputy Ali Mohsen Al-Ahmar, who announced transferring power in Yemen to a presidential council consisting of 8 members who are equally divided between North and South. The Presidential Council of Yemen today, as we know, is the new reality, the new political reality that's ruling the Yemen, the country Yemen. The latest step is apparently a strategic shift in the efforts to unite the anti-Houthi parties. Such a move could determine the nature of the transformation in the post-June 1st phase. The US administration welcomed the truce and the establishment of the new Presidential Council in Yemen. On the other hand, it's remarkable that prior and after the UN truce, and since the arrival of a new Presidential Council to Aden in South Yemen, terrorist assassination and bombing operations have continuously took place against the southern political and military figures affiliated with the STC. Today in our webinar, we're going to discuss all these developments with our guests for today's webinar. First, I would like to thank Iyad from South24 for this amazing opportunity to have this discussion and for giving me this opportunity to moderate this conversation. And I would welcome our guests today, Mr. Omar Al-Baid, the Special Representative of the STC President for Foreign Affairs. Thank you, Mr. Omar, for joining us today. I'm also going to welcome Mr. Ryan Mauro, Security and Counter-Terrorism Analyst. Thank you, Ryan, for joining us today. And also, I'm welcoming Ryan Bohel, Stratford, Middle East and North Africa Analyst. Thank you for joining us also, Ryan. I'm going to start asking our guests some questions. Then we'll have some time for the audience who are joining us to also send their questions. I will start my questions with Mr. Omar Al-Baid. Thank you, Mr. Omar, for joining us today in South 24. And I will start my questions with you, and I will ask you about the STC Council. How do you look today at the extent of the truce? The truce is going to be extended now. We see that the international community is optimistic about this truce. How do you see it in the STC?
Thank you, Hadil. Thank you, South24, for having me today. And well, the truce after 7 years of war, I think it's a good thing for the people. It benefits the people. We hope that we can, through this truce, alleviate the humanitarian situation as much as we can, and solve some of the issues. The experience of the 2 months truce, I mean the previous 2 months truce, there was lots of violations, but at least we don't have a real offensive operations from both sides. So that's a good thing. And the violations here and there, it's normal and it's expected, and to get used to the mechanisms of the truce is important. So hopefully that this will continue, and we can then go to solve other issues. The truce happened finally after the Houthis was trying, thinking that they are invincible in Yemen and they can move forward to conquer lots of cities, after especially the city of Marib. But after the liberating the province of Shabwa by the southern forces, finally the Houthis realized that there is no way to solve these issues through war, and they have to go back to the political means. So finally, they accepted the truth, which is good, which is positive. But beside that, there is benefits of this truth to the people, so we can solve some of the economic problems that's really a danger for the whole economy of the country. We think that the Houthis have two benefits of this, and the thing is that the Houthis would take this opportunity either to breathe, to rebuild for another offensive. And the second thing is to buy time to legitimize their authority in the region. So this is the main benefits of the Houthis, and based on how they are now trying to solve the issues, like for example the opening the road of Ta'az and other issues of revenues of Hodeida port. It's obvious that the truce for them is just an opportunity to rebuild, to legitimize, and move forward to the next objectives in the future. So the other problem that we might see from the truce is how the UN will handle the issues behind after the truce, is especially the trust building measurement, which is some of the economic opening the roads, some of the economic measurements, exchanging prisoners. The main problem here is that what was Martin Griffiths failed in it, that he boxed himself into like 3-4 topics that couldn't really begin the real negotiation and move forward to the negotiation of the political settlement between the parties. And this is one of the main problems. And we hope that the special envoy, Hans Grundberg, takes this in consideration, the failure of the previous one, and not box himself into the some of the issues only, and not tackling the whole problem of Yemen. Taking bits by bits, it's a way of solving the conflicts, but we experienced that these kinds of methodology the Houthis capitalize on, and needs to change the way and just set a framework for the whole peace process, bringing in all the a comprehensive peace process, putting all the issues on the table, trying to solve them, capitalizing on the truce that we have, putting also one of the major problems, which is the unity problem, the problem of the South, on the table, and set a framework for it, and decide how to solve this problem in the future, so we can design a comprehensive peace process that will enhance stability in the region. So this is the way that we want the special envoy to tackle this problems, and not to go in a limbo of being boxed into the just 3-4 issues, and the Houthis capitalize on them and rebuild and legitimize itself on the ground.
Yes, I'll ask you more, Mr. Al-Baid, later about the other critical issues you mentioned, like the issue of the unity and the fact that the current presidential council is in Aden. Where do you see its future? Do you see a return for the current government to Sana'a? Because we know that STC has a vision for its future. But now I will go to Mr. Bohel. Mr. Bohel, as I mentioned in my introduction today, in South24, we see this truce as maybe one of the most serious truces that took place since the beginning of this war. It's also one of the longest, if hopefully it will continue to stand after its extent. What do you think about the current truce, and where the international community can go from here to solve and stop the war in Yemen?
Well, I agree with that overall assessment. This is a unique ceasefire in Yemen's 7-year civil war. It's one of the strongest ceasefires because, in part, some of the drivers of conflict have changed. As Mr. Amr was talking about, the Houthi offensive at Marib has not been successful. The Houthis launched that offensive in the beginning of 2021, in part because they believed that they had military momentum behind them, with the United States becoming more critical of Saudi Arabia. There was a question hanging in the air whether or not the United States would continue to resupply the Saudis, follow through on sanctions, et cetera. So there was a driver that there might be a wedge between the United States and Saudi Arabia that encouraged them to gamble on that offensive. That driver is much weaker now. The United States needs oil market stability in the wake of the war in Europe and Ukraine. So they need the Saudis more. We've seen rumors that Biden might even go to Saudi Arabia in the coming weeks to try to patch up relations. And even before that, we already saw the United States reverting back to its fundamental strategic relationship with the Saudis, selling them arms, redefining what they call defensive weapon systems. There was the Saudis were given the ability to push back at that offensive to help discredit the Houthis' military first approach. So that was one big discrediting of their strategy to continue fighting. The other thing that has changed is now commodity prices have skyrocketed, and that affects everyone throughout Yemen. And the Houthis have to be worried about their domestic front. They still have to provide food and fuel. The previous strategy, which was blocking humanitarian aid, was already creating widespread misery in the north. But now, with them engaging with the diplomatic process, they're unlocking some of that limited humanitarian aid, and it takes some of the pressure off of them on the domestic front. So I agree, the Houthis have not given up on their overall war goals, which is to establish control of the north, establish as much control over Yemen as possible, and consolidate power and continue their ideological project to change Yemen into the political system that they want. They haven't abandoned that, but the drivers that were allowing them to feel freedom last year, those have substantially changed, and that encourages them to engage with this ceasefire. Now, on the Saudi-led coalition side, we've already seen years of the Emiratis, the Saudis, even the Yemeni government looking for ways to de-escalate the conflict, to partially freeze the conflict, to allow retrenchment within it, because they don't see it as a viable path for them to militarily move back into Sana'a. If there was a political settlement that brought them back there, they would be open to that. But the Saudis are not willing to put the military power or the capital into pushing the Houthis out of the capital city. The Emiratis have already retrenched starting in 2019, and the Yemeni government's forces just aren't capable of pushing back at that scale. So they were already in that place where they wanted a ceasefire, and they were waiting for the conditions to change to bring the Houthis to the table.
Yes, I want to add something here to what you said, Mr. Bohel. Do you think the current rapprochement with Saudi Arabia, US rapprochement with Saudi Arabia, is giving the Saudi-led coalition a more leverage against the Houthis? Is it also telling the Houthis that you don't have a lot of options other than to submit to this ceasefire?
Well, it's giving the Houthis the signal that they won't be gaining a military advantage over the Saudi-led coalition in terms of Saudi air power will remain a major factor. They will be allowed to strike military targets, and they will be resupplied by the United States. Those are tactically significant measures. That means that a Houthi offensive on any major Yemeni city will be coming up against systems that they don't have a counter for. They don't have anti-air defense systems at scale, and they won't be able to stop that. And when it comes to the U.S.-Saudi relationship, what we're moving into is a phase of strained pragmatism. There will be criticism on both sides about various policies, but there's a core strategic anchor that has held that relationship together for decades and has now been reinforced with, again, the skyrocketing of oil prices. There's no interest in a rupture. Biden talked a lot about that on the campaign trail of making a pariah out of Saudi Arabia. Some of that was political rhetoric. Politicians do that sort of thing. Some of it was also, it was a different time. There was a belief that the United States could transition away from Saudi Arabian oil faster than is now obviously is possible. So that relationship is being pulled back together by fundamentals. Both sides need each other. Both sides will find a way to work with one another.
Yes, and I'll go now to Mr. Mauro. Mr. Mauro, we hear even before the war in Yemen from the US assessments that Al-Qaeda branch of Yemen is one of the most dangerous Al-Qaeda groups in the world. And there were a lot of efforts even before this war to combat terrorism in Yemen, combat Al-Qaeda. What's today's US strategy? What's today's US approach to Al-Qaeda presence in Yemen, especially that there is an escalating attacks by Al-Qaeda, especially in South Yemen?
Well, it seems like the United States approach right now is to essentially accept the existence of Al-Qaeda, whereas before a lot of the rhetoric was about destroying Al-Qaeda, and you might still hear that rhetoric. It seems that we've moved away from the idea of what most people would consider to be victory, instead looking at terrorist organizations like Al-Qaeda as a nuisance, as a criminal element that's meant to be contained. And that dovetails with the anti-war sentiment, the real almost isolationist sentiment that's prevailing within American public opinion at the moment. So basically you're seeing a focus, yes, on the truce, but also a focus on narrowing down the counterterrorism mission of the United States, and as much as possible being able to say that they're ending the war in Yemen and at least US involvement is being minimized. Now, realistically, when Al-Qaeda starts plotting, as they're always going to do, that's their mindset, that's their purpose, there are going to be drone strikes here and there, but there's going to be ongoing debate about how often you should be doing that, whether the drone strikes are effective, particularly if there are civilian casualties. I think if you look at the effectiveness of drone strikes in Yemen and Pakistan and elsewhere, they are remarkably effective, but that doesn't change the fact that American public opinion seems to be accepting of drone strikes, but increasingly skeptical, and skeptical really of the idea of military engagement of terrorist groups in Yemen, particularly overall. Part of that is due to ignorance. Most Americans cannot locate Yemen on the map. Yemen is not one of the issues that Americans talk about. And so their exposure to events in Yemen is largely limited to tales of civilian casualties, of catastrophes, and stories of American weapons being reportedly falling into the hands of terrorists and extremist elements within Yemen, even if that's not the intention. So you have that element of public opinion playing some type of role where even though there's minimal awareness on the part of Americans, to what degree there is awareness, it's more in the direction of non-interventionism and not being involved. And the Biden administration particularly, and you can tie this to Afghanistan, seems to believe that you can contain al-Qaeda, that our intelligence has grown strong enough, our capabilities have grown dramatically since 9/11. And so whereas before you had to uproot them and actually have personnel on the ground to destroy them, now it's seen more as a problem that can be contained, that when there's a certain level of terrorist activity happening, that will be likely detected and then can be neutralized through drone strikes, covert operations, and things like that. More on the broader scale in the fight against Islamist extremism, you see an acceptance of the so-called moderate Islamists, which would be like the Muslim Brotherhood, al-Islah type organizations, and really the Houthis, where it seems that the ruling class will kind of say, well, yes, they're bad and they don't like us, but we can still work with them. It's not a deal breaker, for example, for the Houthis to have a slogan that says death to America, death to Israel, curse the Jews, victory to Islam. And that's why the Houthis were delisted, because they were viewed as an entity whose existence has to be tolerated and dealt with. And it's hard to do that when you designate someone as a terrorist group. The same goes for the movement to designate the Muslim Brotherhood as a foreign terrorist organization, which failed. And it failed under the Trump administration, which was considered likely to actually do that, actually blacklist the Muslim Brotherhood, which obviously would have blacklisted al-Islah. But that effort also failed. Why? Because there just isn't an appetite for broadening the conflict into one that is more ideological in nature. We want to have a very specific focus just on armed terrorist elements.
Yes, Mr. Mauro, as you mentioned, after the Afghanistan war, and as we all know, and after Iraq war, the U.S. presidents, we saw Democrats and Republican presidents were less encouraged to intervene in the Middle East. But we also, since then, started to witness some attempts to work with local players to combat terrorism. And we saw that happening in Northeast Syria when the U.S. affiliated with the SDF to fight ISIS. We see that happening today in Iraq, where the US mission in Iraq is changing to a more close work with local players to combat terrorism. In the South, the Southern Transitional Council, the Southern forces, with the help of UAE, they have fought Al-Qaeda, and they are today almost the only force that's fighting Al-Qaeda in the South. What does it take for the Southern forces, for UAE, to get the US support in this mission, to get the US attention to this mission and to the danger of Al-Qaeda, to stability of a very strategic region for the US, which is the Gulf?
To get US attention, bluntly, the threat's just going to have to rise. Americans are concerned about the security of the homeland, and they're concerned about human rights abuses overseas. And whenever you talk about fighting or engagement, that's just something that, like I said before, the appetite isn't really there for. One of the big concerns I have is that, particularly because of the withdrawal from Afghanistan, is that there's an opportunity now for ISIS and Al-Qaeda both to have a very, very big victory there. And what happens is that there's a domino effect, just like you saw with ISIS, where once they seize a little bit of territory in the radical Islamist world, that's viewed as a blessing coming from God, saying that their interpretation is correct. You may have disagreed with them before, but if they're winning on the ground, well, then their interpretation is correct. And so my concern is that as Al-Qaeda and ISIS grow in Afghanistan, that's going to trickle over into Yemen, because there are those ideological binds between the Al-Qaeda branches in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Yemen. And they specifically cite this Islamic prophecy that there'll be an army with black flags that rises from the region of Khorasan. And they believe that at the end of time, this holy army will rise up and then they'll be brought to victory with the Mahdi. Now, that's, for most of us in the West, it's hard for us to understand that that can be a mindset, but it's a prevailing mindset among these terrorist elements. And so you have to listen to them when they say there are specific prophecies that we are following and trying to make occur and become reality. And that's what they're saying right now about Afghanistan, is that they're going to be basically competing to see who is that army with the black flags. And so once that happens, I think you're going to very quickly see a ricochet effect happening in Yemen, where Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula is most likely going to rise up and have a sudden wave of recruitment. Or if it's ISIS that wins the competition, you could see ISIS rise up more in Yemen, although I think Al-Qaeda is better positioned to benefit from that.
Yes, thank you. Mr. Al-Baid, we know in the South you have many challenges. You have some political challenges that's connected to the nature of the political history of the South. You want to bring back the South as an independent country, and you have also economic situation like most of the other places in the North. You have economic challenges. How are you dealing with all these issues? What's the priority today?
Well, it's all interlinked together. It's all related together. We because of the problems that we have, economic problems, that's happening, the radicalizing of the people since the unity, especially in the South, resulted in those and creating this atmosphere for those kinds of radical ideas and ideologies to breed in our areas. Unfortunately, this is happening. We as an STC, we've been targeted from all these sides because of our agenda, because of our future agenda of the South to establish a state in the South that's civil, decentralized, democratic, in this area, competing, fighting all these kinds of political Islamic thinking of having the Sunni side or the Shia side of it. So because of that, we've been facing that, and for now, we need to have. We've been doing this, especially our southern forces, since 2015 with the help of the coalition, doing counter-terrorism in our areas. But that's not enough. Policing in these areas is not enough. Aden, for example, doing policing inside Aden is not enough. We need to extend that outside this city and to go outside in the provinces like Abiyan, Shabwa, and the other provinces to fight Al-Qaeda in that areas. And it needs a full program, to be honest, that has a responsibility from everyone, especially the coalition, to help in establishing and implementing program to tackle all layers of cultural, economic, security. So it needs a full kind of program that we can counter such an act. We as an STC, we are doing that, and we'll keep doing that for the future, and with the help of the coalition and the international community for sure.
Yeah, how do you, as STC, coordinate with the Presidential Council on these domestic issues related to Aden, related to the South? And here I mean the security issues, the security fears, and also economic issues, because we know there is a lot of donations that comes from international organizations to Yemen. How easy is it for you today to have a say in where this aid is going to go, how Aden can benefit from this aid, especially that Aden population number is rising because people, also civilians from other areas, even from Houthi areas, are coming to Aden. How do you coordinate all of that with the Presidential Council?
See, the Presidential Council is still new, so the mechanism of decision within the PLC, the Presidential Leadership Council, is not yet formed, to be honest. And as soon as this is formed, then the right mechanism of taking decision within this kind of body, then the policies will start to kick in. Also, this needs at the same time an efficient government, and this needs needs lots of work, to be honest, to have that. As an STC, we will push these agendas within the government by our ministers who are represented in the government, and at the same time by the member of the Presidential Council, our President Idris Zuberi, to enhance and to push these kinds of programs against the terrorist groups, and also at the same time to tackle all the problems that we are facing. You've just mentioned the migration towards in these cities and the migration camps. It's a big problem in the South, that it has it breeds some of the radical thinking in these areas. So it needs to be taken care of in a good way. All these kinds of challenges, RCC will try to push it within the channels that's available right now. But definitely we'll try to use the help of the international community to push the other powers or forces within the Yemeni government to accept and to help those kinds of policies and agendas.
Mm-hmm. Yes, Mr. Bohel, I have a question for you about the U.S. role in Yemen. We were all optimistic when Biden administration appointed Mr. Linder King as the U.S. envoy to Yemen because he has a long history of an experience of work with the Gulf region, with the Middle East. And we thought that the U.S. Mr. Linder King will come with a special plan, special strategy for the war in Yemen. But today it looks like the U.S. envoy role has faded. And all we hear from Mr. Linder King is that he supports the UN resolution, the UN plan. Do you think this is a lack of interest of the U.S. from the U.S. side, or because as we talked at the beginning of this webinar, that the US wants to leave it to Saudi Arabia to solve the issue of Yemen, because they don't want more tension, obviously, with Saudi Arabia about the war in Yemen? Do you think the US has a special strategy for Yemen today?
Well, as Mr. Morrow was saying, there's a strong non-interventionist, isolationist political trend in the United States right now. And that is playing out in Yemen. It's also playing out in the Israel-Palestinian conflict, where there's still no major strategy to revitalize any peace process there. It's part of a wider strategy, a part of a wider strategic trend. And it's not being driven by a vision for what the region should look like. It's being driven by domestic US politics, which is informed by 20 years of war in Afghanistan and the invasion of Iraq. And the public has taken conclusions from that many of these wars are either unwinnable or they are the problem of local actors. And Yemen is probably one of the best examples of where this is playing out, where there's a values that the Biden administration would like to bring to the fore of their policy. They want to stop airstrikes that kill civilians. They want to bring in humanitarian aid. They want to freeze or end the conflict. These are all great aspirations, but they're not willing to put very much political or diplomatic and certainly very little military capital into trying to make these values happen. So they will use rhetoric about how they want the war to end, about how they want to support processes like what we're seeing through the United Nations, but they're not willing to enforce very many of these things. A great example of this is when we saw the Houthi missile attacks on Abu Dhabi. Some of them were reportedly aimed at Al Dhafra Air Base, where U.S. troops are stationed, and reportedly the U.S. THAAD system was deployed to shoot these systems down. This was an attack on an American airbase that under previous administrations or previous years, going 10 years back, might have resulted in military retaliation directly on the Houthis within Yemen. But the Biden administration saw no value in that. They were content to play defense, to deploy a few symbolic warships to the UAE, and to give the Emiratis and the Saudis some logistical support to try to destroy the launcher sites. And that's this administration's preferred approach to the region. Local actors will take the forefront. The United States will act as a major stabilizer for things like cross-border conflicts. So those troops in the UAE and in Kuwait and elsewhere, they're there to deter things like Iranian cross-border invasions, but they're not there to stop Houthi missile attacks or even Iranian drone attacks. Those sorts of things are not seen as a strategic threat to American interests anymore. Those are things that they want to push on to the local actors to solve. And as a result, we see with Yemen, diplomacy is their choice because it's cheap. It's the easiest thing to do. And if it's unsuccessful, the American public is unlikely to notice. If it is successful, the Biden administration will take credit for that in the way that they can and try to make what political capital out of it. And that's pretty much where we are with the US strategy in Yemen, is letting Saudi Arabia, the UAE, the Houthis, other geopolitical changes within the global environment kind of impose conditions on those actors, and the US will support whatever comes out of that.
What about the questions of the South, the political questions of the South? At some point, do you think we'll see the US have a say in this issue?
Well, the United States, we've seen this play out with the Kurds as well, who are pro-US and have a lot of good credentials in terms of democracy. And there's been problems within Kurdistan, of course, but there's also the SDF is well liked within Washington, and so is the Kurdistan regional government in Iraq. That was not enough for the United States to switch strategies and support secession when they made that attempt a few years back. And this goes back to a wider US concern that if they start to allow things like secession happening, if there are new countries emerging on the map, they don't know where that necessarily ends. And then they don't know, then they're not willing to support a movement like that until basically that movement has already done it. Once there's a de facto secession process, the United States could get behind that, but the United States is unlikely to support it beforehand out of concern that there could be ripple effects on other key allies within the region where secessionist movements still exist, and even beyond the Middle East. They're always concerned about borders changing. That's still, even though the U.S. has somewhat undermined its own policies on borders changing, generally the United States does not like to see borders change unless it's done through a very transparent, highly democratic process that we would see in a place like Europe. It would be unlikely to see that happen in Yemen.
Yes, we saw that, as you mentioned, in many other places, like with the Kurds. Unfortunately, the rhetoric in the Middle East that the US wants to reshape the Middle East and reshape the countries, while we see the US is very hesitant to support such popular requests by the people on the ground. Mr. Mauro, I have a question about Al-Qaeda recent attacks in the South and the nature of how Al-Qaeda is moving in Yemen in general. We see Al-Qaeda focusing its attacks, focusing its aggression against the South, against the Southern forces, against the groups that are fighting Iran-backed militias, fighting al-Houthi. What does that tell us about the nature of the ties and the relations between al-Houthi, backed by Iran, and Al-Qaeda? What does the dynamics on the ground in the Yemeni war tell us about the ties between Iran itself and Al-Qaeda?
Well, some of the activity by Al-Qaeda is just going to be because of opportunity and having to fight the most effective players on the ground and needing to show that, yes, they can attack any organization, any group of forces that appears to be successful. They have to respond to that in order to show that they're even alive. That's basically how Al-Qaeda operates. So on the one hand, you can have a lot of that independent acting happening on the part of Al-Qaeda. But I know that there is that Yemeni intelligence report that was submitted to the United Nations accusing the Houthis of having ties to Al-Qaeda. And although I can't confirm that intelligence report's accuracy, and we should be skeptical because intelligence reports are sometimes wrong, there is a great number of specifics in that report that have been reported on in various media outlets. And the fact that Iran supports Al-Qaeda means that it's very plausible for the Houthis to support Al-Qaeda on a tactical level if it makes sense. I would assume on the part of the Houthis, if you were talking to one of their strategists in a confidential area where they felt secure telling the truth, they would actually say that they would like Al-Qaeda to be their enemy. They would like Al-Qaeda to beat back any other force that can be presented as an alternative to the Houthis. Because if your enemy is Al-Qaeda, as opposed to some more moderate alternative, then the international community is more likely to support you. The international community is more likely to say, we may not like you, but hey, you're better than the other guys, Al-Qaeda, and therefore we're willing to work with you. A specific example of Iranian and Al-Qaeda cooperation that may serve as a model for what goes on in Yemen is Abu Muhammad al-Masri, the former #2 man of Al-Qaeda, who had safe harbor in Iran and then was killed by Israeli agents. The Iranian regime actually gave him a false ID in order to live there and hide. And according to the Yemeni intelligence reports that are being commented on, the same model is being used by the Houthis for some Al-Qaeda terrorists who they released from prison. And again, now, why would they do that? Why would they release Al-Qaeda terrorists who they're supposed to be executing, killing, out into the field? And the only answer I can come up with is that they actually believe it's good for Al-Qaeda to be their adversary. It gives them advantages on the battlefield and advantages in international public opinion.
What about Al-Qaeda connections with the Muslim Brotherhood in Yemen? We also hear that the Muslim Brotherhood branch of Al-Yemen, Al-Islah Party, is known to be also one of the most radical Muslim Brotherhood branches in the Middle East. Today in the new presidential council, the Muslim Brotherhood is having less leverage, less influence. Do you think this is pushing Al-Islah Party to move Al-Qaeda against the South?
Well, in terms of the connections between Al-Islah and Al-Qaeda, what you said is absolutely correct. That of all the Muslim Brotherhood branches around the world, Al-Islah is one of those that's most connected to Al-Qaeda. In fact, when the push to designate the Muslim Brotherhood overall as a foreign terrorist organization failed, one of the alternatives I was putting forth was to just designate the specific Muslim Brotherhood branches most connected to other terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda, and the Yemeni wing of the Muslim Brotherhood was chief among them. And that's because Sheikh Zindani, one of the founders of the Islah Party, is a designated terrorist. There isn't a gray zone where people are arguing over this. He is very clearly a longtime associate of Al-Qaeda, a supporter of Al-Qaeda terrorist operations. He openly calls for an Islamic State, which is an irreconcilable goal with the goals of the other actors in the region and the United States. His son has explicitly called on Yemenis to wage jihad against the United States. And Zindani also has close ties to Hamas fundraising, which adds a whole nother layer to this, because the Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas are essentially one entity. The Palestinian wing of the Muslim Brotherhood is Hamas. So when you have countries like the UAE signing the Abraham Accords with Israel, that is going to raise the ire of Zindani and people like the Islah Party and Muslim Brotherhood. And that's going to be another element of the conflict with them. Trickling it down even beyond Zindani, we know that Anwar al-Awlaki, when he's the former head of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, known as one of the big radicalizers of Americans into the violent jihad, he found shelter in 3 homes owned by Islah members before he was killed by a US drone, and one of those houses belonged to Zindani. So it's more than just one radical preacher. It does trickle down to, on an operational level, all sorts of interconnections between Islah and Al-Qaeda. And there was actually a point where Al-Qaeda openly said, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula openly said that they were allying with the Muslim Brotherhood and that they were going to become more open in working with those that they disagreed with against common enemies. So a lot of that in terms of the Al-Qaeda Muslim Brotherhood connections is very strong in Yemen. And I'm not sure how we're going to be able to permanently decouple the Muslim Brotherhood from Al-Qaeda in Yemen in any meaningful fashion. You might be able to convince them to have a distancing of ties, but a permanent break in ties, that's going to be tough because both of them are calling for the establishment of an Islamic State. By the way, Osama bin Laden said in his own writings that were captured from his Abbottabad compound that Yemen was the one place out of all the countries on earth that he was most optimistic about creating an Islamic State in.
Mhm. Mr. Albaid, I have two questions for you. My first question is also about combating terrorism in the South. We saw in the State Department reports for 2019 and 2020 positive praising for the efforts of the Southern forces along with UAE in combating Al-Qaeda. We also witnessed many meetings between President Aidarus Azubaidi and U.S. officials. Do you talk with the U.S. about this issue, about coordinating in combating terrorism, about your fears from Al-Qaeda, growing influence, Al-Qaeda attacks in the South, and what's the U.S. reaction in this regard?
Well, first we do operate in the South, the Southern forces doing counterterrorism under the umbrella of the coalition. So that's our channel, our umbrella that we're operating in. So through that channel, we coordinate with internationals who are interested in doing counterterrorism in our region. Giving the talks about these kinds of topics with the Americans, this goes back to 1993. Summer 1993, Ali Salim al-Bid, the ex-vice president of the United Country at that time, and the president of the southern state that was declared in 1994. He met Vice President Al Gore in that summer, and handed over all the list of names and complaining about the terrorist groups who returned from Afghanistan, for example, Zindani and the rest of them, about that have been used by the late Ali Abdullah Saleh, the late President Ali Abdullah Saleh, against the southern leadership at that time. So it goes really back at that time. The talks about these issues, and we share the same enemy with America on these things. We share the same goals, the values. We want to stabilize the region, especially in this geopolitical location and the maritime lines. So we have those kinds of shared values and goals that we cooperate because of them and these kinds of issues. So we in the STC, we've been targeted, and we've been raising these issues with the Americans and in all the meetings that we have, and yeah, that's what's actually happening between us.
Yes, also my other question to you, Mr. Albaid, we know that the ultimate goal for the Southern Transitional Council is to achieve the political goals for the people of the South, to bring the South as an independent country as it used to be in most of the times during the history. But today there is a new political entity for Yemen, and they're taking Aden as their capital. All these Yemeni officials are stationing in Aden. What's the political roadmap that you're thinking of to achieve your goals, your political goals that are connected to the South, connected to the Southern people goals, far from the Yemeni conflict? And does this roadmap have any kind of international or even regional support? And here I mean like any countries like the US, Russia, China, or regional countries like the Gulf region are supporting your vision or helping you to achieve this vision?
See, we are now in a transitional period where there is war, and we need to go into a comprehensive peace process that will be designed to solve all the problems. Among them is the problem of the unity, and I go back to the comments of Mr. Ryan Bo about the situation, the ideas of secessionist groups is not really rosy in this area. That's true, but because we think that it's not about secession, it's about restoring country, because of the failed unity, because we want to stabilize the region, and we think that this unity has a problem and we need to solve it. But the way to solve it is the main question. How to solve this issue, how to solve the problem, is through a peace process, through a peace process designed to accommodate all the main issues of Yemen. One of them is, or the main issue of them is the problem of the unity. So we need to sit there without barriers, speak loud about it, discuss it rationally, and find solution. What's applicable, what's workable for this region, how to stabilize the region. That's the main question, how to stabilize the region. So we think we share this, this idea with the GCC, as it's the GCC consultation that was happened in Riyadh in April. The statement, the final statement of the consultation, mentioning that the southern problem, or the southern the unity problem, should be discussed in a framework, in a special framework within the peace process, and that's a way of how to solve it, and hopefully that we can reach that point where we can solve this issue in the table without violence, without using the military solutions to hinder such talks.
Yes, I just want to mention that my last question to Mr. Al-Baid was from Waddah Al-Mufilhi, one of the audience. I will start taking more questions from the audience. I have another question from the audience to Mr. Bohal, and the question is from Fadl Muhammad Naji. And he's asking that this ceasefire is not achieving or solving the humanitarian issues in Yemen in general. Yes, maybe there is no fight or intensive fight on the ground, but many of the economic hardships are not being lifted. And here he's mentioning the Houthi refusal to open Ta'az roles. The Houthi also, we know that they have not transferred the Hodeidah port revenues to the central bank of Yemen. We know also that the salaries of the employees in the Houthi controlled areas have not been paid yet. Does the US have any leverage, any tools to pressure the Houthi to also make a step in this regard?
Well, the U.S. does have tools, but like we've said before, they're unwilling to use them. They have much more leverage that's within their comfort zone of policy over the Saudi-led coalition. And we saw that when the coalition was advancing on Hodeidah port, and the Trump administration put pressure on them to halt the advance and then even to withdraw because of the concerns of destroying the port and disrupting humanitarian supplies. They can do that with the coalition. With the Houthis, there's far fewer options. They don't have any economic links. They have no diplomatic links. They're not going to lift terrorism designations any further than they already have. And they're certainly not going to carry out military airstrikes or things along those nature that might really shock the Houthis into concessions. None of those are real viable options at the moment. And so the United States simply has to take whatever the Houthis offer them, and rely again on the Saudis to try to change battlefield dynamics or to create different pressure points against the Houthis that they can respond to. Because while the United States, if it did begin something like an air campaign or a naval campaign against the Houthis, that would be decisive. That would also be starting a new war in the Middle East, and the public has zero appetite for something like that. And as long as that is the case, the United States will be mostly playing the role of a bystander when it comes to Houthi behavior.
Yes, Mr. Bohel, do you think today we know that the war in Ukraine is the priority today for President Biden administration? Also, this war is pushing President Biden to many strategies with other allies like Saudi Arabia, pushing them to move in certain political ways in other fronts in the Middle East. Do you think today's war in Ukraine is going to impact the U.S. relation with Iran, and especially that today we hear that the U.S. may allow Iran to sell its oil. how is this step going to impact Iran's leverage in Yemen and the Houthi leverage?
Right. The war in Ukraine is sucking up all of the United States' geopolitical attention at the moment, and will continue to do so for the near term. As long as the Russian forces are still conducting offensive operations within Ukraine, that's where American focus will be. Right behind that, not very far, is also focus on China and the rise of China and whether or not they will be emboldened by the invasion of Ukraine to carry out other behaviors that the United States does not want to see, like a possible military operation against Taiwan. That limits the amount of manpower, material, diplomats, economics, political capital that is available for conflicts within the Middle East. And we're seeing some of that play out. We're seeing that definitely play out with the Saudis. They obviously want to restore that relationship and get it as close to the pre-Biden relationship as they can. They won't get it there, but they're going to try because they need that oil market stability. And it's also playing out with a certain extent with Iran, which even before the invasion of Ukraine, the Biden administration was eager to create a new nuclear deal with the Iranians so they could de-escalate with the Iranians, so they could free up some oil onto the market. They were very eager to do so, and the war in Ukraine has incentivized that further. Unfortunately, there's a fair bit of things that the Iranians have thrown out as demands that the U.S. considers non-starters, and so we see these the nuclear talks are increasingly looking unlikely to produce a comprehensive deal that might return us to close to the 2015 JCPOA. So there's an Iranian block on that, but there's definitely strong U.S. interest to de-escalate with the Iranians. And I did see the report about potentially allowing Iranian oil to come onto the market. We'll see if that happens. We've also seen them try to do that with Venezuela and try to get that oil onto the market. But the war in Europe is overshadowing everything. And it means that conflicts like Yemen are getting even less attention than they were before. And another place we can see this is the threat of a Turkish operation in northern Syria. The Turks are feeling very emboldened in this moment because everybody's focused on Ukraine, and the United States is not making the same kind of threats as they did in 2019 to block such an invasion at this moment, because Turkey's a NATO ally, entered the NATO alliance to combat the Soviet Union. Its traditional role is suddenly back now that we have Russian aggression in Europe. And that will continue to act as a major constraint. It'll also create, as we talked about, the commodity shocks that are incentivizing the Houthis to be a little bit more conciliatory and concessionary because they have a domestic front that they need to keep an eye on.
Yes, another question for you, Mr. Bohel, from Dr. Ahmed Atif. He is asking, and I have another also, someone else from the audience asking a very similar question, and it is from Nasima Al-Aidarous. Mr. Atif is asking, in Czechoslovakia at the time of the war, the country was divided into two fully independent states to deal with the fears and with the political ambitions of the people. Someone else is asking that the US allowed the division of Sudan and giving South Sudan its independence. What determines the US vision for such political ambition for different people around the world? Why we see the US is very strict when it comes to Yemen unity. They always emphasize on Yemen unity, while they would support these political ambitions elsewhere.
Well, with Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia, that came in the context of the end of the Cold War, which was seeing the breakup of the Soviet Union was already happening. Germany was reunifying. There was a context where the United States was open to border changes because the Cold War was ending. The geopolitics of some 45 years had suddenly ended. We're not in that moment where we're seeing suddenly the whole balance of power within the Middle East being rewritten. So because we're not seeing that, the United States isn't quite open to changing borders or supporting the change of borders because they're not certain of the effects. With the Czechoslovakian breakup, with the Yugoslav breakup, the US was certain that communism was not going to gain an upper hand in those processes, and so they could be more supportive of those. With the South Sudan example, which I think is a bit more viable for comparing to Yemen, that came after 50 years of civil war, and the South Sudanese had to go through multiple political processes and had to fight a very long hard struggle against the North until they'd essentially imposed independence on their own. And that was something the United States can get on board with, is once an independence move is seeking power, is able to change facts on the ground and actually control and hold territory and govern themselves, the United States becomes more open to supporting them. Now, part of the reason they went against Kurdistan, even though the Kurdistan regional government checks many of those boxes, is because Iraq and Baghdad proper was friendly with the United States. The United States did not want to jeopardize its security position in that country by supporting the breakup of Iraq. So in that particular case, even though the KRG hit the threshold, there was a strategic alliance with Baghdad that the United States didn't want to lose. So it goes on a case-by-case basis. Sometimes we have moments of history where borders are being rewritten peacefully or violently, in some cases with Yugoslavia, and the United States will go along with basically what the victors impose. In other cases, there are slow independence movements which are able to change facts on the ground at such a scale over such a time that the United States decides that they don't really have much of a choice other than to accept that. They're not going to try to roll back South Sudan and bring it back into North Sudan after such a long conflict. So South Yemen could end up in that situation over time, but we're certainly not in that moment today.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Mauro, there is another question from the audience about environmental disasters taking place today in Yemen due to the war. We hear Biden administration, we hear the Democrats talking a lot about environmental issues, while there is no attention to these issues when it happens due to Iran-backed groups' aggression. Also, the same question again, how can we push the US administration to pay more attention to these issues taking place in a country like Yemen?
Sure. Well, as for the double standard when it comes to environmental disasters, I don't know the reasoning for that. It's something I've noticed as well, where the attention is solely on the United States in regards to issues of environmental disasters, but then things happen overseas and it's not even mentioned. Like for example, even the Russian invasion of Ukraine, you won't hear the environmental disasters resulting from that as part of the equation, because understandably the news attention's focus is on human casualties, immediate casualties, as opposed to the eventual casualties that come from pollution and environmental disasters and things like that. As for how can you get more attention from the United States? There's really two ways you can look at it. Number one is you just wait for the inevitable moment when, and I'm sorry to say this, when the threat to the United States gets much higher because of lack of involvement, because of Afghanistan, because of different issues, so that when Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula rises up or the Houthis start firing rockets at Saudi Arabia, UAE, or US forces, that you're ready at that moment to say, look, this is part of a trend. This is part of a bigger problem. It's not just a one-off incident. The other thing that you could do is really emphasize the non-Islamist or anti-Islamist position of your organization and of the effort. Because I know that a lot of my colleagues who used to be big on supporting movements overseas have distanced themselves from them over the years, because they've been disappointed to find out that this group or that group claimed to be moderate, but actually wasn't. Again, that brings me back to the Muslim Brotherhood example. You had a lot of people that were saying, oh, well, that was a moderate democratic group that just was anti-American. And then you come to find out the truth, that they're terrible at governing, that the people turn against them once they're in power. You can see that that's not really a solution. But from the standpoint of America's interests, if there is an organization that is wholly and completely anti-Islamist, not just anti-Sunni Islamist, but then pro-Shiite Islamist or vice versa, then that presents an opportunity for the United States, because there still is an interest in promoting a progressive type of reformation in the Islamic world. And so any entity that comes forth and says, look, we want nothing to do with the Muslim Brotherhood or the Shiite Islamists or Islamists on any side, and we want to upgrade our interpretations and our ways of governing with modernity, I think that's likely to get notice from the United States and get the sympathy of even the American people to whatever degree they're exposed to it.
Thank you, Mr. Mauro. And I would love to end with the question to Mr. Albaid. Mr. Albaid, how do you, it's obvious that in the Southern Transitional Council, don't see the political ambition of the people of the South as a sideline problem. You see it one of the main issues, one of the main things that needs to be answered to maintain stability in Yemen in general. How do you tell the world that there will be no stability in Yemen without full rights given to the people of the South? And the other part of this question also is from our audience today. How do you do this balance between maintaining good partnership with the Presidential Leadership Council and try to help this council stay in place while also push for the political ambitions of the people of the South?
All right. So I'll start from the second question. See, our mission here as an STC, or our goals, is to administrate the South and the rest of the liberated areas, and to provide services, economic, to have a good economy even with the war, and try to alleviate all the suffering of the people. So that's our mission for now, during the transition period that we are in, the wartime. Our ambition for the future, that will have its channel, as we said, through the political process. We in the SCC, we think that that's very important also to work with the PLC, because if we have a fragile government and at the same time fragile government, very a collapsed economy, that's a recipe for a terrorist group to be growing in these areas. So in order to secure our areas and try to work towards our programs and ambitions to terminate those kinds of groups from our land, we have to cooperate with the PLC. We have to be a constructive and player in this formation. So that's our main goal, and why we are doing that, related to our main objectives. Or main goal is to have a southern state. We think also at the same time, for the future stability in the region, we think that the unity is not stabilizing the region because of different political characteristics of the two nations. We think that it's wrong, and between centralizing and decentralizing, differences of the north more centralized, south more decentralized. This coalition in this system, it won't happen, because we tried it in '94. We tried to decentralize the country. There is a war after that. We tried the national dialogue, tried to decentralize the country. It didn't happen because there is a war happened after that, because the north, the political characteristics of the north, doesn't accept decentralization, while on the contrary, the south can't work unless there is a decentralized government. So these different characteristics has to be solved in a rational way, to find, we think, as an STC, that the best solution is to have go back till before 1990, and then we find another way of cooperation and relationship between us and the region, and also the north, or Yemen at the same time. So that's how we think that stability should be really considered when we talk about the unity of Yemen, and unity between the South and Yemen at the same time. So that's how we see it, how we want to discuss this in a comprehensive peace process.
Thank you so much, Mr. Amr Al-Baid. Thank you so much, Ryan Buher, and thank you, Ryan Mauro, and thank you for everyone who attended this webinar. And at the end, I want to apologize from Lena, from Imad Arawi, from Aziz Zaid, from everyone who asked questions that we didn't have enough time to answer. I was trying my best to be as inclusive as possible in the questions and not to ask the same questions to our panelists again. I think we covered most of the points related to our issue today. Hope to see you in other webinars. Thank you again for your time, and thank you South 24, and thank you for everyone who attended this.